Hello YouTube and welcome to my channel. Today we're going to talk about metaphysics, epistemology, analytic philosophy, and transsexuality. Specifically, I'm going to respond to the video Transphobia and Analysis by Olly, whose YouTube channel is the very popular Philosopher Tube. This video will be divided into 5 parts, an introduction, and then 3 sections where I explain why Olly's 2 main claims in his video are incorrect, and I will finish with a conclusion. Before we begin, I want to say that I realize this may be a sensitive topic for some, and so at the outset it should be understood by all that this is a conversation at the hopes of arriving at truth. It is not meant to disparage anyone, and all people should be free to participate in this discussion and share their experience without fear of judgment. Discrimination against transgendered individuals is wrong, and in that spirit of inclusion, let's press forward. Intro. Olly makes 2 central claims that are related. The positive version is that gender statements made by trans people can be true. The negative version of that claim is that what Olly calls the transphobic position, that is, that people always are the gender that they were assigned at birth, is dependent on metaphysical skepticism. There are a few terms here that require unpacking, and the first term we need to unpack is trans people. Olly defines transgendered in opposition to cisgendered, such that transgender means one whose gender does not match the one they were assigned at birth. This gives us at least 4 possible gendered ways of being, with the possibility of more depending on if one believes that there are more genders than male and female. That topic is outside the scope of this discussion, but I simply wanted to acknowledge that there are people who identify as other than male and female. A second term worth defining is metaphysical. Metaphysics is the branch of philosophy that deals with how things are, what exists, and what does it really mean to exist. Like Olly, I also want to relate it to the term epistemological, which comes from the branch of philosophy epistemology, which asks questions like how do we know what we know, and what is knowledge? So if Tiffany is a transgendered female, there are 2 statements we can make, one metaphysical and one epistemological. 1. Tiffany is female, and 2. Tiffany knows that she is female. And it is here that I would like to begin the conversation, because these statements look like they have 2 different meanings. After all, consider the similar statements. Donald Trump is the 45th President of the United States, and Tiffany knows that Donald Trump is the 45th President of the United States. In this case, the 2 statements are clearly different. Donald Trump is the 45th President is clearly different than Tiffany knowing that Donald Trump is in fact the President. Donald Trump could be President and Tiffany might not know that he is. Or conversely, we might imagine a counterfactual situation where he is not President, but Tiffany might mistakenly believe he is President. We can in fact create a truth table like this. Let's look at the 4 options. Donald Trump is the 45th President and Tiffany knows it. This is pretty obvious. Tiffany just happens to know it, probably because she watches the news at least occasionally. Donald Trump is the 45th President, but Tiffany doesn't know it. This seems pretty obvious as well. Tiffany, for whatever reason, doesn't know who the president is. Maybe she's been in a coma since right before the election and just woke up. When we asked her who the president was, she assumed, like most people would under the circumstances, that it was Hillary Clinton. But she happened to be wrong. There is a second scenario under this case that's a little more complicated. What if Tiffany believed Donald Trump was the 45th president, but she had no reason for believing it? For example, what if, like before, she was in a coma since right before the election, and then woke up and we asked her who the president was? She said Donald Trump. But then we asked her why, and she said, well, Hillary Clinton won the election, but Donald Trump got plastic surgery to look like Hillary Clinton, killed the real Hillary Clinton, and has been acting as president in her stead. Now, this obviously sounds crazy, but her wrong reasoning somehow led her to the right conclusion, that Donald Trump is in fact the 45th president. In this case, even though Tiffany's belief was true, we wouldn't say she knows Donald Trump is president. She just got lucky. This is going to be an important point later on. The third possibility is Donald Trump is not the 45th president, but Tiffany believes he is. Again, pretty obvious. In a counterfactual situation, if Donald Trump were not the president and Tiffany, for whatever reason, believed Donald Trump was the president, then Tiffany's belief would be wrong. And finally, Donald Trump is not the 45th president and Tiffany doesn't believe he is. Again, pretty obvious. Donald Trump isn't president and Tiffany knows he isn't. Okay, this was all pretty obvious, so why did we go through it all? Because it's important to see how this is supposed to work, so when we do it with the gender statements, we can see where it goes wrong. So let's do it, but this time with the gendered statements. Tiffany is female and she knows she is female. Same as the first time, it's obvious. Tiffany is female, but she doesn't know she is female. Okay, this one's a little weird. Tiffany is female, but doesn't know she's female. What does it mean to be female but not know you are female? We'll explore that, but the next one is even weirder. Tiffany is not female, but he believes he is female. This is even worse than the previous one. In the last one, Tiffany just didn't know what gender she was. In this one, she actually believes she is a different gender than the one she is. These two examples raise the important philosophical question: can someone be wrong about the gender they are? This is important for the argument at hand, because if someone can't be wrong about what gender they are, then it raises the question of whether they can be right about it, and this directly calls into question the first of Olly's claims, that gender statements made by trans people can be true. So here we can distinguish between what we may call the classical or the traditional and the postmodern views on human gender. The classical or traditional view is in some sense biologically deterministic. Human bodies are either male or female, and under normal circumstances we can distinguish between male and female bodies because of primary and secondary sex characteristics, and if we have the proper technology, genetic differences. Because gender is biologically determined, a person who is biologically male or female is therefore a man or a woman, respectively. In the classical view, the terms male and female carry meaning in the sense that one can use the terms male and female or man and woman and make objective statements, true and false, about human beings and their experiences. A person with XY chromosomes who says "I'm a woman" can be called incorrect because the extension of the term woman doesn't include people with XY chromosomes. In the postmodern view, the terms male and female are actually social constructs. They don't carry objective biological or metaphysical information, but information about social perceptions and the relationship an individual has to the rest of society. But Olly doesn't think it necessarily has to be. But this begs the question as to what the terms male and female actually signify, if anything at all. This will be an important point later on. It may seem obvious to us that the terms male and female are deeply rooted in biological factors, but the postmodern view does make some interesting arguments, and it shouldn't be dismissed without a thorough understanding. For example, the postmodern view does, at least on a surface level, appear to deal with the cases of intersex individuals better than the classical view. People born with ambiguous gonads or gonads that do not match their genotype often receive surgery so that they can better match one gender or the other. Thus, an XY male may have the functional external genitals of a woman and an incompletely formed penis, and might have the male genitals removed and live as a woman. In this example, social expectations seem to be defining the gender of this person much more significantly than biological reality. In fact, we are attempting to change a person's biology in order to conform to social expectations. Now, I bring this up not because I think the postmodern view is right. In fact, I think it's wrong, and I hope this video helps explain why. But I bring it up because this context is necessary to understand why both the main claims made by Olly are wrong, on both a metaphysical and epistemological level. Not only do gender statements made by trans people fail to be true on a metaphysical level, they necessarily fail to be true on an epistemological level. And not only is it not the case that the classical view of gender, which Olly calls the transphobic position, relies on metaphysical skepticism, but in fact it is more true of the postmodern view of gender. Part 1. What does it mean to be trans metaphysically? As stated above, Olly defined transgendered as one whose gender does not match the one they were assigned at birth. Now, obviously, I don't think Olly means to include trivial cases where a child born with XY chromosomes, functioning male sex organs, etc., is identified as female by an exceedingly inattentive nurse or doctor. What Olly is referring to is that someone with XY chromosomes, functioning male sex organs, etc., might believe that they themselves are female, or contrarily, a person with XX chromosomes, functioning female sex organs, etc., believes that they are male. This is relevant because if an inattentive nurse were to make such a mistake, any casual observer would be able to say, "the nurse is wrong." In other words, the nurse's statement, whether she's right or wrong, has descriptive meaning, because it is a falsifiable statement. The nurse is trying to describe a state of affairs, the gender of the child, and we can call her description accurate or inaccurate based on observable criteria. But this relies on our basic acceptance of the classical view of gender. Similarly, under such a view of gender, a person who says, "I am a woman" or "I am a man" can be assessed to be right or wrong under similar biological criteria. In other words, one can have a justified true belief about their gender, which is falsifiable based on criteria which we have identified as biological. What's interesting is that the trans activists seem to want to make the same case for trans people. What they argue essentially is that a nurse or doctor who identifies a child who has the biological traits commonly associated with males at birth as male, when the child later identifies as female, in fact misidentified the child. In the same way, that same nurse or doctor who identifies a child with the biological traits commonly associated with females at birth as male would be wrong. This is at least the most common way of talking about gender identification. There are some who argue that a trans woman doesn't actually become a woman until they identify as a woman, and so they can say something like, "I was a male, but then I became female." This is an interesting perspective and avoids some of the problems of the trans argument, but still doesn't overcome the main one, which is, if biological criteria cannot be used to justify beliefs about one's gender identity, what kind of criteria can we use? In other words, if Olly argues that gender statements made by trans people can be true, what is it that makes them true? There are a couple possibilities. One might argue that if gender roles are socially constructed, then one's role in society determines one's gender. But this seems to be the opposite of what many trans activists are arguing for. Gender for them doesn't seem to be an expression of society on the individual, but an individual expression towards society. There's a sense one gets when talking to a trans person that they don't mean "I'm a woman" to be a statement about society, but a statement about themselves. Alternatively, gender could be performative. One is male or female because of what one does, not what one is. Okay, but what actions are male and female making? The strongest one that comes to mind is the act of conceiving, carrying, and ultimately bearing a child. But many trans people will argue that in fact childbirth is not inherently feminine, and men can get pregnant too. So what actions are there that if one undertakes makes them a certain gender? Maybe it's simply the act of identifying with a particular gender that makes one a certain gender. Okay, fine, but how does one identify with a gender? If it's by an action one takes, we haven't solved anything. Compared to the performative view, we've just added the word identifying. Perhaps we could say that it is just by believing oneself to be a particular gender that one is transgender. And here we get to the inconsistency in Olly's position. Olly argues that gender statements made by trans people can be true, but to say that something is true or false is to say that a belief corresponds to a given state of affairs. But if there is no external state of affairs outside of one's belief, then what can that belief correspond to? In other words, if believing that you're female makes you female, then does the word female, as used by a trans person, actually mean anything that one can be right or wrong about? Part 2. Beetles and boxes. The first philosopher we'll examine in this context is Ludwig Wittgenstein. Specifically, we'll talk about his beetle in a box experiment in regards to the context of private language and the sensation of pain. Pain seems to be an easy thing to understand. After all, we all experience it. Or do we? We all use the word pain in reference to experiences that we've had, but are we sure that we use it in the same way? After all, it's not uncommon for people to disagree over what is painful. But why is this the case? Well, consider this question. Can I believe that I'm in pain but actually be wrong? It doesn't appear possible. After all, who would tell me? Who could know that I'm in pain if I myself don't? In his philosophical investigations, Wittgenstein writes, "The essential thing about private experience is really not that each person possesses his own exemplar, but that nobody knows whether people also have this or something else. In other words, we all use the word pain to refer to some kind of sensation, but because another person's sensations are unknown to us, we have no way of verifying that we all use the word pain to refer to the same sensation. The meaning of the word pain, if pain has any meaning at all, therefore cannot refer to the inner sensation." Wittgenstein created this thought experiment. Imagine that everyone carried a box with them that has something inside it. You can look inside your own box, but you're not allowed to look at anyone else's box. Since birth, you've been told that what's inside your box is a beetle, and everyone calls what's inside their own boxes beetles as well. But everyone only has looked at their own beetle. We can imagine in this world people using the word beetle in conversations, such as a teacher telling our class to put your beetles on the floor, and no one having any problem understanding each other. No one in this world would have any reason to suspect that they might have different things in their own boxes, and yet it's certainly possible. Therefore, the meaning of the word beetle cannot refer to whatever is in the box. Similarly, words we use to refer to inner sensations such as pain cannot get their meaning from that sensation. And here we can talk about the postmodern view of gender again. If being a woman is indistinguishable from feeling like a woman or believing one is a woman, then being a woman is exactly like being in pain. Saying, I am a woman is simply using the public word woman to refer to a private experience. We have no way of knowing what that sensation is, what it's like, or what the person actually experiences, because woman has no public language use except to signify some kind of sensation is happening. Gender for the postmodernist is like Wittgenstein's box. Everyone has a gender, but we have no way of knowing that people who use identical gender words to describe experiences are actually experiencing the same thing. Because gender for the postmodernist is private language, gender statements made by trans people aren't falsifiable, just like statements about being in pain aren't falsifiable, and therefore, contrary to Olly's first claim, they can't be true or false. But, cries Olly, this is exactly what I've been saying. The transphobic position requires metaphysical skepticism, that we can't know what our genders really are, and what genders we really are. But this is not the case. I can, under the traditional view of gender, make true and false claims about gender. If gender is not a use of private language, but a word that refers to a publicly observable phenomena, such as biology, then claims about gender are falsifiable. And in this case, gender statements made by trans people are false. It is only by denying the biological referent of gendered words that one is forced to say that gendered words refers to private sensations, and are therefore meaningless. This can be shown another way. Part 3. Reverse Twin Earth. In The Meaning of Meaning, Hilary Putnam makes a famous thought experiment called Twin Earth. If you'd like to listen to me and Frege from Sense of Frege discuss that article at length, we did that on Logos Live. Check out the link in the description. However, by reversing his thought experiment, we can use it to show the problems of the postmodern view of gender. Suppose that somewhere in the universe there is a planet basically identical to ours. We'll refer to it as Twin Earth. It revolves around a star that looks identical to our sun. It has oceans where we have oceans. People live exactly like we do. And in fact, they speak the same languages we do. There's a twin equivalent to every person, place, or thing. So on, so forth. On Twin Earth, your twin does everything you do. He works the same job, lives in the same house, enjoys the same things, etc. The only difference is that your twin claims to be the opposite gender than you, and he claims it for the exact same reasons. In other words, if you say, I know I am a girl because I like wearing dresses, on Twin Earth, your twin says, I know I am a boy because I like wearing dresses. If you say, I am a boy because I have XY chromosomes, your twin says, I am a girl because I have XY chromosomes. Here's the rub. If gender terms mean anything at all, one of you has to be wrong. After all, if male and female mean anything at all, then a woman can't be a man and vice versa. If gender is merely a belief or feeling, then it would be the case that people who have the same beliefs or feelings would be the same gender. Ex hypothesi, you and your twin are identical in every way, down to every molecule, brainwave, and thought. But how can you prove which one of you is wrong, and by extension, which one of you is right? What could you use to show that the way you are using the word man, woman, boy, girl, etc. is correct? Now, the gender traditionalist would have no problem because he defines gender terms according to external, verifiable phenomena. The gender postmodernist, though, can't. That's why Olly's not only wrong when he says that the transphobic position requires metaphysical skepticism, he's got it completely backwards. The gender traditionalist can make meaningful statements about gender. The gender postmodernist can't. It is the gender postmodernist that plays the part of the metaphysical skeptic. By denying external reference to gender words, the gender postmodernist cannot talk about gender meaningfully. And to quote Wittgenstein, "What can be said at all can be said clearly, and what we cannot talk about, we must pass over in silence." So in conclusion, what is left of Olly's two claims? He said that gender statements made by trans people can be true. But we have shown that if gender statements have any truth value at all, then gender statements made by trans people are by definition wrong. After all, to be trans is to identify as a gender different than your biological gender. So if gender refers to one's biology, then claiming to be trans is simply to misuse gender terms. But if gender doesn't have an external reference, then gender words appear to be an example of private language, and private language has no meaning to be true or false about. So he also said that the transphobic position relies on metaphysical skepticism. But we have shown that the transphobic position makes the metaphysical claim that gender is a biological fact, and it is in fact that trans activists who are skeptical of this metaphysical claim are the ones who cannot make a meaningful competing metaphysical claim. Thus, it seems to me that neither of all these statements are true. So, what are your thoughts? Have I addressed all these arguments successfully? Do you have counterexamples to show how I might be wrong? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and if you like this video, please hit like and subscribe. In the meantime, go with God.